Not going to read the scripture to you tonight because the way we're going to be approaching the message is we'll work through the passage together verse by verse. And so we'll read it then instead of reading it all together right now. This is Wednesday. If you have a chronological Bible or any type of Bible that breaks down the days of the last week of Jesus' life, you will find that there are no events recorded for Wednesday. We believe that there were events that took place on the Jewish Wednesday, which would have been our Tuesday evening. So Tuesday after sundown. Tuesday after sundown, Jesus was at a dinner at the house of Simon the leper. Martha was serving there, and that's where Mary took the fragrant oil and anointed Jesus' head and feet. And really, that's what set off Judas Iscariot. He said, we could have sold that for 8 months' wages and given that money to the poor. Of course, he wasn't interested in the poor. He was interested in how much he could pilfer from the bag, since he was the bag man for the group. So he then, that night, which would have been late Tuesday or early Wednesday morning in the darkness, that's when he went to the priests and made his arrangements to look for an opportunity to betray Jesus. So a lot of people believe that Jesus rested on Wednesday. I think that Tuesday was such a full day that we don't know that some of these things, maybe the days weren't really listed as well, and so there could have been that there were 2 days events that were there. There certainly was more on Tuesday that happened than we could have covered last night. So we're going to cover part of it tonight. I never have done this before, but we're going to look at the connection between Jesus' last week and his return and what he actually had to say about it. Because Jesus himself was the one who connected his time there and what was going to happen in the future. So we're going to be looking at Matthew 24 together. I will probably say some things tonight that will sound different from what you've ever heard any other preacher say. And so don't let me blow your mind. Just if I say something, and you think I got it wrong, well, we can talk about it later and we'll work it out. But there is a very popular view, a very popular interpretation of Matthew 24 that I think is not right. So I'm going to be talking about that tonight as we look at it. So glad you're here tonight. We're missing a few folks who are out of pocket, some folks under the weather, and some folks on trips. But we're glad we're here tonight, and we're going to be here, and hopefully the Lord's going to meet with us, and we're going to be blessed for being here. Brother Holland, would you? Bibles to Matthew 24, chapter 24. During this week, we have been connecting these events in the last week of Jesus' life with things that are connected to his second coming. We've looked at his triumphal entry, and we've called it the royal entry, as he went in on Palm Sunday, and that, of course, reminds us that he's coming one day as King of Kings. And then we looked at his cleansing of the temple and cursing of the fig tree, and we knew that meant he was also coming as in judgment. And then last night, as we looked at the questions that Jesus asked, we talked about the question that will be asked of us when Jesus returns again. So we've been connecting those things, and it's not really something that I just made up on my own, because I believe that Jesus connected these things too, and we see him connecting the events of his last week with his return, particularly in this passage that we're going to look at today. There in Matthew chapter 24, he begins, it says, "Then Jesus went out and departed from the temple, and his disciples came up to show him the buildings of the temple. And Jesus said to them, 'Do you see all these things? Now remember that phrase, these things. We're going to see that phrase, that very same combination of words several times. Do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say to you, not one stone shall be left here upon another that shall not be thrown down. Now, we actually could have begun a few verses earlier in the last 3 verses of chapter 23, where Jesus has this lament over the city. He says, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. See, your house is left to you desolate, vacant, empty, void. Your house is left to you desolate. For I say to you, you shall see me no more until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." Talking about a second coming, isn't he? You will see me no more till you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's what they said when he came in triumphal entry, right, in royal entry. But he's saying again that it won't be said again until his return. He's connecting what's going to happen in Jerusalem with the events of his return. And he's assuring us that one of the things is that beautiful temple. Now, it wasn't as beautiful as Solomon's temple. If you've been reading your Bible through, you probably read recently the parts about how the entire thing was overlaid with gold, and there has never been a temple like the one that Solomon made. But the Jews were pretty proud of the one that they had in Jesus' day. Now, it wasn't much when people returned from Babylonian exile and began to build it, and the generation that remembered Solomon's temple wept. They just cried when they saw what they were building. It couldn't even begin to compare. And the prophets had to encourage them. But when Herod came along, in order to ingratiate himself to the Jews, he embarked on a tremendous enlargement and beautification of the temple. In fact, in Jesus' day, they had been 46 years already in building it at that time, and it wasn't going to be finished until 66 AD. In other words, Jesus crucified probably in either 27 or 30, somewhere in there. So 30 more years they're going to build on that thing, and it's going to be, and even the Romans admired the temple. Its architecture and the costliness of the decorations and the building materials and the way it was laid out. It was an impressive building. The Jews like to say, if you've not seen the temple in Jerusalem, you've never seen a beautiful building. And you can imagine, even the disciples were proud of it. They were wanting to show, boy, Jesus, look at this. Look at how those carvings are there. Look. And to hear Jesus say, look, you can take this to the bank. Isn't that what assuredly, verily, verily, I say, you can take this to the bank. Not one stone will be left on another. It's all coming down. I think that probably there was stunned silence there as they walked along. But when they got to the Mount of Olives, into the garden there, and they could sit down for a minute's rest and look back across the Kidron Valley and see the temple there, they got up enough nerve to come to Jesus and ask him the questions that we find in verse 3. It says, now as he sat on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. There was no other one around. They came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Now, I want to ask you, y'all are all looking at your Bibles right there. How many questions did they ask? How many questions did they ask? 3 questions? What do you think? What? He said, when will these things be? What will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? Okay. I will submit to you. Now remember, I told you to pay attention to these things. When he said, when they ask, when will these things be? What are they referring to when they say these things? The same thing Jesus was referring to when he says, do you see these things? He's talking about the temple, the buildings that were there. All right. So what they were asking is, when is the temple going to be destroyed? When is the temple going to be destroyed? That was that question. And I would submit to you, they had a second question, because it wasn't a when question, it was a what question. Okay? They had two different questions. He says, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? One of the things I learned in the first few weeks I was taking elementary Greek was that when you see the word and, many times it can be translated even, because it's a repetition of the phrase before it. And so let's think of it, that question in this way. What will be the sign of your coming, even the end of the age? In other words, what's the sign of your coming? I'm talking about the end of the age. In other words, when everything's going to come to an end. The word that's translated coming there is the Greek word parousia. It was used for when the king would come and arrive, and he would visit a country, and he would come and set up his court there. So the idea, what's the sign of your coming? What's the time of your return for your kingly visit? And we recognize that that's really going to be the end. That's when this age is going to end. So they had two questions. When are all these things going to be destroyed? And then what is going to be the time when this age ends, which is when you're going to return. When you're going to return, and then this age that we're in. Now remember, for the Jews, there was this present age which was bad because of sin, and we were looking for the Messiah to come to start the kingdom age when everything would be put right. They believed, that there were two ages, and the Messiah's coming would be the marking, the dividing line between those two things. So they're saying, when are you going to come as Messiah? What's the sign of your coming? And then the end of the age. Now, understanding that they were asking two different things here is very important, because really in the verses that follow, Jesus is going to be answering two different things. And some of the things he says is going to relate to the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem, which is going to happen in 70 AD. And so some of those things are going to pertain to that. And then some of them are going to be about when he comes back again. And we need to make sure that we can discern which one that he's talking about, lest we become confused. Now, to make it a little even more confusing, the next verses don't have to do with either of those things. These verses, in verses 4 through 14, don't have to do with the destruction of the temple or with Jesus' return. They have to do with things that people might get confused. Notice what Jesus tells them from the very beginning. He says, Jesus answered and said to them, "Take heed that no one deceive you." That sets the tone for the next 10 verses. Take heed that no one deceive you. And he's going to talk about things that people are going to mistake as signs of the times. Everything that he's going to mention, except for the very last thing, are going to be things that are not about his coming, and things that if you look at those things, you're always going to be upset, you're always going to be confused, and you're always going to be wondering, because these are things that are false signs of Jesus' return. All right? Jesus said, "Take heed that no one deceives you." First of all, "For many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many." False Christs. If you've ever read the book of 1 John, you know John tells us that when he was writing, the Antichrists had already arrived. People who were claiming to be the Messiah. In fact, there were false messiahs before Jesus came into the world, and there were false messiahs after Jesus came into the world. And he's warning them, and we're going to see this is not something he's going to say just once. He's going to say it over and over again. Do not be deceived by people who come claiming to be me. Of course, there's still people claiming to be Jesus in our world, right? In Brazil, they got a guy down there that's claiming to be Jesus. So there's people in different places. But Jesus is saying, look, that's going to happen. That's not a sign. That's people trying to deceive you. There will be false Christs. Notice he says, and you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you are not troubled, for all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. Wars and rumors of wars are not signs of the end. I mean, how could they be? Wars and rumors of wars have existed for all of history. That's just something that goes on all the time. It is not a sign of the end. I know a lot of people do. I've heard sermons preached, and guys will talk about how in the 4,000 years of recorded history, we've only had less than 300 years of peace, and so on, and talk about the things we have going on. We could talk about the war in Ukraine, or we could talk about the threatenings that China makes toward Taiwan, and we can talk about all the different kinds of things that are going on in wars, the wars we just got out of with Afghanistan. It just looks like, but man throughout his history has been warlike, and that is not a sign. The end is not yet. Jesus is going to tell us where the end comes, and that's the very last phrase in verse 14. He's going to get to the end, but the end's not yet. Now notice what he goes on to say. He says, why is it not? He says, because nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom. And he says also, there's going to be famines. Yeah, we've had those. Pestilences, plagues, pandemics, earthquakes in various places. Yeah, all kinds of natural disasters, whether they be earthquakes or hurricanes or volcanoes or tornadoes or all the droughts and floods, and we've had all those kinds of natural disasters and wildfires. He says all these things are just the beginning of sorrows. Now, I've heard a lot of sermons on the fact that means those are birth pangs. And what that means is that as the end gets close, those things are going to happen more frequently, just like contractions come more frequently on the woman. But Jesus doesn't press that illustration like that comparison like that here. He's just saying, look, we're just getting started. It's the beginning of sorrows. That's just getting started. Those are not signs that Jesus' return is near. What they are signs of is signs of Jesus is saying, look, this is what life is always going to be like. Don't be deceived. Don't think it means, don't sit there and twiddle your thumbs hoping you're a deliverer. Jesus is going to come back so you don't have to do anything about the world problems. This is life. This is how it's going to be. There's always going to be wars. There's always going to be plagues. There's always going to be natural disasters. There's always going to be food shortages. All those things are going to happen. And there's always going to be persecution. Look, beginning in verse 6, I guess that is. My eyes are deceiving me. Or 9. Yeah, it's 9. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and kill you, and you will be hated by all nations for my name's sake. And then many will be offended and will betray one another and will hate one another. Yeah, we've gone through that, persecution and people betraying each other. And then he says, and then many false prophets will rise up. Well, we've had that too. They'll deceive many. And because lawlessness will abound, the love of many will grow cold. You know how long it took Christianity's love to grow cold? The very first letter to the first church in the book of Revelation was to the church of Ephesus. And what was their failure? You've left your first love. And that seventh letter to the church of Laodicea, what was its problem? You're neither hot nor cold, you're You're lukewarm. I want to spit you out of my mouth. Jesus said, look, this is what's going to happen. But he who endures to the end shall be saved. And this gospel, now listen to this now. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come. Then the end will come. Our missionaries right now are very diligently trying to fulfill this condition. Because when it says that the world, the gospel will be preached to all the nations, it's not talking about nations like the United States or Canada or England or France or some other nation like that. It's talking, the word that's translated there is the Greek word from which we get our word ethnic. All the different ethnic groups, every people group around the world is going to have the gospel preached to them. There is a database in most missionary headquarters where they have already anthropologists and missionaries and other people have gone into all the countries of the world and discerned where the different people groups are with their own, where they have their own identity as a tribe or a clan or a nation, and they're working on getting the gospel to every one of those. When that happens, he says, then the end will come. But don't be deceived. Don't be deceived. No. He says, these things are going to happen. These will go on, but these are not signs. Okay? But Jesus said, this is what life will be like. And I'm going to come back to that point at the end. Now we're going to enter into this part where he's going to talk to us about the Great Tribulation. And in this section, I believe he is actually talking about what's going to happen in 70 AD when the temple is going to be destroyed and the city actually is going to be destroyed. And I believe that that's the case because we're going to see in a minute that Jesus is going to say that we need to learn a parable from the fig tree because when you see the fig tree putting forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. And he says, this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. And I have some other reasons. Let's look at this. Is he talking about here, when he's talking about the Great Tribulation, is he talking about the 7-year period before the millennium? Is that what he's talking about? Is he talking about the Great Tribulation that's going to come right before he comes back? And then the judgment's going to come? Well, let's see how he describes it. He says, therefore, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, whoever reads, let him understand. Well, I read it. Do you understand it? No. I wish the Lord had given us a little bit more to go on there. I think he was a little overconfident in our ability to understand. But that reference, that 3 times in the book of Daniel, it talks about the abomination of desolation. And it has to do with the fact that there's going to be an idol or a something that defiles the temple that's going to cause worship to stop there. But for that to happen, the temple has to be standing. There hasn't been a temple in Jerusalem since in almost 2,000 years. Now, there's a lot of people who have things, they'll say that the Jews have secret plans for putting, that they're just in a moment's notice, just as soon as they blast off that mosque that's sitting where they want to have the temple to be, they're ready to go in and build their temple. But I would submit to you that if we believe that Jesus could have come back at any time, that his return, nobody knows this time, but basically he's wanted every generation to believe and to act like his return is going to happen now. Why would we do that if we know the temple hadn't been built yet? I believe that the fact that it's talking about the temple still standing indicates that this is before the temple was destroyed. And Jesus is beginning to talk about when all these things are going to happen, when all these stones are going to be broken down so there's not one left on top of the other. And then notice what he says. Here's his counsel. Here's what he instructs them to do whenever they begin to see this happening. He says, when you see that, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to take anything out of his house. And let him who is in the field not go back to get his clothes. And woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. Oh, pray that your flight may not be in winter or on the Sabbath. Now that kind of gives you the impression that when you see these things happening, you're supposed to try to escape. Right? Flee to the mountains. Get away from here. Just find a way to get away. Don't hesitate. Don't go down in and pick up something. Just when you see it happening, get away from here. When Luke writes about this, he actually says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, this is what you need to do. He says, when you see the siege coming, get out. Get out. But when Jesus comes back, are you going to be able to get away? There's no fleeing when Jesus comes. He's not talking about his return when he talks about this. He's talking about that first question that the disciples asked him about when will these things be? But notice how he describes it. He describes it in verse 21. He says, for then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been since the beginning of the world until this time, no, nor ever shall be. And you'll say to me, well, he's got to be talking about the end time tribulation because he talks about how terrible it's going to be. Yes, but did you notice that little phrase at the end that said, nor ever shall be? Apparently, time goes on after this tribulation. There's going to be future after that. So Jesus is talking about something that's going to happen, and then life is going to go on. Which would, of course, fit in with it being the destruction of the temple and of Jerusalem. And notice also he says, and unless those days of the tribulation were shortened, no flesh would be saved, but for the elect's sake, those days will be shortened. And I can tell you, commentators have given evidence that is exactly what happened when the Roman army came and destroyed the temple and the city. The army came so suddenly and unexpectedly on the city that they retreated in a haste, and they left most of their provisions outside the city. And because they realized they didn't have the food to sustain a long-term siege, the city had to surrender to the Romans. That's exactly what Jesus said. God shortened the time that would happen. So now notice again, he says, now if anyone says to you, look, here's the Christ, or there, do not believe it. For false Christ and false prophets will rise and show great signs and wonders to deceive, and if possible to deceive even the elect. Now see, I've told you beforehand. Therefore, if they say to you, look, he's in the desert, do not go out. Look, he's in the inner room, do not believe it. For as the lightning comes from the east and flashes to the west, so also will the coming of the Son of Man be. For wherever the carcass is, there the eagles will be gathered together. In other words, when Jesus comes, everybody's going to know it. We quoted that verse from Revelation 1:7 a couple of nights ago. When he comes, every eye will see him. Every eye will see him. And I don't think it's going to take worldwide television to make that happen. You know, we're going to know it not because of the internet. We're going to know it because we're going to see it. Just like you could see a flash of lightning that's circumnavigated the globe, you could see Jesus coming again. Every eye will see him. Notice he uses again that, in my Bible, I've circled again the word coming, because that's the second time that this word parousia is mentioned in it, and it's used about the second coming of Christ. So in that verse, he's definitely talking. He says, you don't have to worry about asking, are there false Christ? Is Christ going to show up somewhere? When he shows up, you'll know it. You're not going to have to ask yourself, is that him? No. You know. Okay? So, verse 27 is the first time now in a long time, that we've had a definite reference to the fact that he is going to come, and when he comes, it'll be inescapable. Everybody will know it. Every eye will see him. But as he goes on to explain that in the next verses. So immediately after the tribulation of those days. Now I want to talk for a minute. You have to pay attention to your pronouns here. Now, and it helps that I always had fun with English grammar. And I know that's not everybody's forte, but if you'll just indulge me for a minute. It's important in this passage to be able to remember the difference between this and these, as opposed to that and those. Usually, when I think of that, I think of that this and these refers to something that is close, something that is nearby, and that and those refers to something far off, more distant. So if I had a bunch of books here and a bunch of books on the table in the back there, and I said, can you bring me one of these books? It'll be the ones, either the ones that I just told you about, or it's going to be the ones that are close by. But if I ask you, would you bring me one of those books? I'm talking about the ones that are further away, or maybe ones that I talked about a long time ago, or a few minutes ago. So when notice that we've seen this hint to us before, because as he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem, he keeps talking about these things. These things. But notice he says here, but immediately after the tribulation of those days. He's not talking about these days that are going to be close by. He's talking about those days that are going to come in the distant future. After the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. The stars will fall from heaven and the powers of the heavens will be shaken. In other words, the world is going to be in an uproar. All the powers that be are going to be in turmoil during that time. The world's going to be all shook up. Then he says, then the sign of the Son of Man will appear in heaven. And then all the tribes of the earth will mourn, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds. That's what he's told us several times. And he's going to come in the clouds. When they see him ascend to heaven in Acts chapter 1, the cloud receives him and takes him up. And then the angels come and say, this same Jesus that you've seen go away will come in like manner. He's going to come in the clouds. He's going to come in the clouds, all right? So you're going to see him coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. Well, we've seen that particularly in the book of Revelation, and he's told us that before. He's going to come with great glory. And notice he said he'll send his angels. The angels are going to be there, and there's going to be the great sound of a trumpet. We've heard that before, haven't we? That there's going to be the sound of a trumpet when Jesus comes back again. And then they will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the end of heaven to the other. Jesus has told us, we referenced that Monday night when we talked about his return. He had mentioned in Matthew chapter 13 the two different parables, the parable of the net that was drawn in, and then he says that's the way it's going to be at the end of the age, remember? He says that's the way it will be at the end of the age. He says the angels will come and separate the wicked from among the just and cast them into the furnace of fire where there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. When he talked about the wheat and the tares, he says, the Son of Man will send out his angels and they will gather out of his kingdom all things that offend and those who practice lawlessness and will cast them into the furnace of fire and there will be wailing and gnashing of teeth. This is the same coming. He's talking about his return here. There's going to be the whole cosmos is going to be shaken And we're going to see all of these things happening. It's going to be unmistakable when Jesus comes again. Now, it's important that we remember that he was talking about those days in the distant future. Because now notice this parable of the fig tree. Now learn this parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So you also, when you see all these things, when we hear these things, what are we supposed to think about? Have I confused you all that much? These things means the destruction of Jerusalem. He's used that same phrase from the very beginning. They ask him, he says, do you see these things? They're all going to be torn down. When are these things going to happen? These things. He's used that over and over again. He's talking about it here. When you see these things, know that it is near, at the doors. I assuredly say to you, this generation will by no means pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will by no means pass away. Jesus could not underline that. He could not highlight that. He could not bold that anymore. This is fact. But if that means, if he was talking about his return, his second coming, that didn't happen in that generation, did it? Well, some people say, well, what he's really talking about there is the Jewish people, and that when you see the nation Israel reestablished, one generation will not pass away until Jesus comes back. We're past that. We're past that too. Now it happened in 1948, and a generation is usually thought to be 40 years. And that's the reason that guy wrote that book and got everybody upset back in 1988. They said 88 reasons why Jesus is coming back. In 1988, we had to have special meetings at the college. Or I was one of the teachers at ETVU at that time, and we had to have special meetings with the students to calm their nerves down because they thought Jesus was going to come back before the school year was out. Jesus is saying, look, this generation will not pass away until these things, this destruction that I'm talking about, is going to happen. I can guarantee it. Jesus was standing, talking to the disciples, sitting, talking to the disciples right now in 30 AD. 40 years later, the city was leveled. That generation did not pass away until it all happened. Now notice how he starts off the next paragraph. But of that day. When we talk about that, and as opposed to this or these, when we're talking about that or those, we're talking about something that's in the future. But of that day and hour, no one knows. Not even the angels of heaven, but my Father only. And Mark actually says that not even the Son knows when this is going to happen. But as the days of Noah were, so also will the coming, there's that word again, coming of the Son of Man be. For as in the days before the flood, they were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage until the day that Noah entered the ark, and did not know until the flood came and took them all away. So also will the coming of the Son of Man be. Then 2 men will be in the field, and one will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, and one will be taken and the other left. When I first started preaching back in the early 70s, I was influenced by a book who went back to Genesis and began to say, since Jesus' return is going to be like the days of Noah, he says, let's go back. And if you read those verses in Genesis 6, it says there was a population explosion during that time, and in the early 70s, that was a big topic about how we're going to outstrip our capacity to feed the world, and population explosion. It was a violent time. They're talking about how there was violence in their heart, and so We could talk about how violent crime has increased, and we talked about there was evil intentions of the heart, and we can just talk about all the corruption that has happened in the world. And he was saying, look, it's just like it was in Noah's time. And that is so not what Jesus was saying here. Jesus is not saying you can go back and see what society was like in Noah's time, and that's the way it's going to be in society when Jesus comes back. That's not what he's saying at all. He's saying, look, they were just going on with life as usual. They were eating and drinking. They were marrying and giving in marriage. They were just in the normal course of life, completely clueless as to what was about to come on them. They didn't know what was going to happen until the flood came and took them all the way. Jesus says that's the way it's going to be when I come back. And whether you want to see the rapture in that thing about one being taken and the other left, that's a discussion for another day. I'm about to run out of time, so I'm not going to get into that, but I'll be glad to deal with that one of these days when we study the book of Revelation together. We'll do that. But the idea is they thought life was just going to go on just like it always does. One day just like another, just ordinary life. They were just living like common people live. And all of a sudden it happened. Nobody knew that it was going to happen. So that's what he says it's going to be like. Jesus' coming is going to be, he says, I'm going to come like a thief in the night. It's going to be a surprise to everybody. You're not going to know what it is. In fact, notice that what he goes on to say, he says there's a command that comes out of this, and it's the command to watch. And we've seen before the warning to watch out and not be deceived, but now he's saying here's the command to watch. Watch therefore, for you do not know what hour your Lord is coming. But know this, if the master of the house had known what hour the thief would come, he would have watched and not allowed his house to be broken into. Therefore, you also be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. I preached on this one time, and I knew y'all were too sharp for me to be able to pull this over on you. But I started the sermon by asking, how many of you that believe that Jesus really, really is personally, visibly going to come back to earth? I asked them to raise their hands. Everybody raised their hand. So I said, well, how many of you believe that Jesus is going to come back in your lifetime? And we were all a lot younger then. How many of you believe that Jesus is going to come back? You mean not just that he could, you firmly, truly believe he's coming back in your lifetime? Not as many raised their hands that time. Good number, but not as many. I said, how many of you really believe, you firmly believe that Jesus is going to come back before we finish this service together? No, not that he could, but that he is. He's going to be here. Well, nobody raised their hand. And that's what I showed them. I'm going to come at an hour you don't expect. Nobody was expecting him that hour that we were there. They knew it could happen, but they weren't really believing it was going to happen that day. We need to be ready. There's several parables that come after that. He talks about the faithful and wise, the good servants and the evil servants, those who are doing their jobs when the master returns. He talks about the wise and the foolish virgins who are ready they've got their lamps ready. They're watching and they're prepared for Jesus to come. He talked about the parable of the talents, that men who had been faithful servants during that time, they had been busy doing the Lord's work and making a profit for the kingdom. Then he talked about the judgment of the sheep and the goats, and how we're going to be judged by whether we've done his will, we've loved others as much as we've loved him, and shown it by our good deeds toward them. So he says, but the point is, you've got to be ready. Now see, there's two things you got to take away from this. Number one, the fact that Jesus is going to come back is certain. You can't get around it. And there's several things that I think indicate that. Number one, I believe his second coming is as sure as his first coming. He came the first time, and then he gave us his word. He says, I'm going to come again and receive you unto myself, that there you can be where I am. So it's as certain as his first coming. And so his death and resurrection, he told him all these things were going to happen, and when he told him he was coming back, it was just as sure as when he told him, I'm going to be crucified, I'm going to be buried, and 3 days later I'm going to rise again. You can count on it. He said it, and it happened. But just looking at what we've read, his return is as certain as his description of what life was going to be like. Jesus told us there's going to be wars, rumors of wars, plagues, there's going to be earthquakes, there's going to be false messiahs, there's going to be people whose love grows cold, there's going to be people who fall away from the church, there's going to be people who persecute the church. He says, listen, this is the way it's going to be. Don't let these things confuse you, but that doesn't mean you should ever be confused to think that I'm not coming. I'm coming. You know, Peter talks about, he says, so many people say, well, so much time has passed. Where's the Lord? The scoffers are going to come in the last day saying, you know, we've been all these times. You know, people have been saying Jesus has been coming back all my life. All my dad's life, all my granddad's life. You could just keep on going back. There have been 2,000 years of people saying Jesus is coming back. He hadn't come yet. What makes me think it's going to happen? Because for him, 1,000 years is as one day, and 1,000 years is one day. Our time, he's not on our schedule. But he told us that that's the way it was going to be. He wasn't wrong about that. He's not going to be wrong about his coming. And not only that, but he was right about the destruction of Jerusalem. It happened exactly what he said. He said, not one stone be left on another. Did you know that when the Romans took the city, somebody by accident set the temple on fire? And the raging fire melted the gold that was adorning the temple. And the soldiers, it flowed, melted into the cracks, and the soldiers took apart every stone so they could get all the gold out of it. How did Jesus know that was going to happen? Just as sure as he was right about that, he's right about the fact that he's coming again. And just as sure as the sunrise, you understand that the whole world it revolves by the Word of God. He's the one who gave it all the instructions. It's working. Jesus coming again just as sure as the sun coming up in the morning. Now, if we'd have been living 40, 50 years earlier than now, we were back in them, I'll be giving you an illustration about Douglas MacArthur saying, I shall return from the Philippines, and he did it. But listen, Jesus' return is a lot more sure than that. You can count on it. It is certain he is coming. But what is uncertain is when it's going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen. Do you ever hear anybody setting a date? You can almost take it to the bank. He's not coming that day. Right? It's amazing to me why some people keep setting dates for when Jesus is going to come. You understand, not only we don't know, we can't know. How could Jesus have told us what the signs of his coming were going to be when Jesus himself did not know when his return was going to be? Over in Mark, he says, Mark's version of this, he says, no one knows this day, no one, not even the angels, not even the Son knows. It always gets me. When I finally realized Jesus said that, I said, why did all these guys start thinking that these things that Jesus said here are signs of the times when Jesus didn't know? How could he give us the signs of the times if he didn't know when it was going to be? But we don't know. I would say we may not know, in the sense not that it's possible we could know. I'm saying we may not know because God's got that in his secret things. You read Deuteronomy 29:29, sometimes the secret things of God belong to him. There are some things that God doesn't tell us. So we're not going to know. And besides that, it wouldn't do us any good to know, would it? If you knew that Jesus was coming back at 3 o'clock in the morning, it would freak you out. You know, if you knew that Jesus was coming sometime soon, we'd all be weeping, you know, we'd be a basket case. We don't need to know that. And we certainly don't need to know that Jesus is not going to come in our lifetime, that it's going to be still 2,000 more years from now before Jesus comes back. Why? Because then we'd be a bunch of slackers if we were that way, right? We don't need to know. We shouldn't know. What we should know is that what Jesus said is he could come at any time. He could come at any time. There's an old story I read when I first started preaching, so that's a long time ago, you know, about a man who was out visiting and he ran upon a manor house over in England somewhere, and he looked through the gate and saw a beautiful English garden. You know how they're very proper about those gardens. But this one was particularly well kept and neat. And he spotted the gardener over there, and the gardener spotted him. The gardener said, "Would you like to come in and see the gardens?" And he said, "Oh, yes." And so he came in and kind of walked around with the gardener. And so he said, "Man, you're doing a good," the visitor said, "You're doing a good job here. I bet your master up there really enjoys looking out the window down here." He says, "Oh, he doesn't live there. He lives in London." He says, "In fact, I haven't seen him in years." "You haven't seen him in years?" "Man," he says, "you got this place looking like you expect him to come tomorrow." He says, "Oh, no, sir. I expect him today." That's the way we got to live, folks. Now, if I was more technologically inclined, I'd be playing a song for you right now called "I Wish We Had All Been Ready." If you were in a youth group in the 70s, you probably knew that song. Man and wife asleep in bed. She turns around, he's gone. I wish we'd all been ready. This goes on and on. I wish we'd all been ready. We can't determine whether other people are ready or not. We need to make sure we're ready. And then let's do all we can to get our loved ones, our neighbors, our friends, our co-workers. Let them know that there's something going to happen. It's certain it's going to happen. We don't know when. Could be tonight, could be in the morning, could be next week, could be next year. But we need to be ready. Because it's going to happen. Father, I pray tonight that we would realize that you were so spot on about how Jerusalem was going to be destroyed. And you were so right about how history was going to play out, that we understand that it is certain that you're coming back. Father, the Lord, the writer John says that everyone who has this hope in him, this hope of your return, this blessed hope, everyone who has that purifies himself as you are pure, so that when we see you, we will be like you, because we will see you as you are. Father, may we live as if your coming is tonight. May we ready our hearts. We would repeat those last words in the book of Revelation. Even so, Lord Jesus, quickly come. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.